In the early 19th century, the British Empire was at the height of its power, stretching across vast swathes of the globe from the Caribbean to the Pacific. Among the farthest corners of this empire were two lands that would come to shape much of the modern world: Canada and Australia. These lands were not merely territories under British control. They were profound symbols of the imperial mission the British had embarked upon since the time of Queen Victoria. The seeds of British influence were sown in both regions in subtle ways, but with profound consequences. The foundation of British rule in Canada began with the arrival of French settlers in the early 17th century. However, it was not until after the 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century that the British gained full control of the region. Following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the French ceded Canada to the British, effectively marking the beginning of British dominion. In North America, the British implemented a system of governance that blended both French and British institutions with the aim of maintaining order and efficiency within this newly acquired territory. During the next several decades, the British worked to integrate Canada into the imperial system. English-speaking settlers from the British Isles began to arrive in increasing numbers, and by the early 19th century, the population was growing rapidly. To manage this influx, the British introduced policies that encouraged both agricultural development and industrialization. The British influence on Canada's economy was evident in the establishment of the fur trade and the construction of infrastructure such as roads and railways that linked the growing settlements to the larger British Empire. This laid the groundwork for a deeply intertwined relationship with Britain. Simultaneously across the world, the British Empire had already established its presence in Australia. Long before the first fleet of convicts arrived in 1788, Australia's original inhabitants, the indigenous peoples had lived on the continent for thousands of years before European exploration. However, the arrival of British ships marked the beginning of a new chapter in the continent's history. The British viewed Australia primarily as a penal colony, an isolated place to transport their criminal offenders. The first fleet, which carried over 1,000 convicts, set sail in 1787 and arrived the following year in Botany Bay. Though Australia began as a penal settlement, it quickly developed into a more complex society. British settlers introduced their agricultural methods and began to establish farms and businesses that would sustain the colony. The British also introduced the Anglican Church as the state religion and established a legal system based on English common law. Over time, Australia began to emerge as a society that was distinctly British in character, but also developing its own unique identity. The relationship between Britain and its colonies in Canada and Australia was not one of complete domination, but rather one of cooperation and mutual benefit. Both regions were seen as valuable parts of the British Empire, and in return for their loyalty, they were afforded certain privileges. Canada's vast natural resources, such as timber and furs, were traded within the empire, providing wealth to both the colonies and the Crown. Similarly, Australia's agricultural products, including wool and wheat, would become vital exports that contributed to Britain's global trade networks. While both Canada and Australia were growing economically, they were also becoming increasingly aware of their own identity and the role they played within the empire. In the case of Canada, tensions arose as the French-speaking population began to assert its cultural and political rights. This led to the establishment of a dual system of governance, where both English and French Canadians would have representation in the political structure of the colony. Meanwhile, in Australia, a sense of national pride began to emerge as the colonies developed their own distinct cultures and began to push for greater self-rule. For much of the 19th century, the British influence on Canada and Australia remained strong, but by the turn of the 20th century, the winds of change were beginning to blow. Both nations were on the cusp of transformation, and the legacy of British rule would evolve into something much more complex. In Canada, the issue of confederation began to dominate political discourse as the provinces debated how to form A unified country, Australia, too, was in the midst of a similar debate with calls for a national government that would represent all of the Australian colonies. These discussions would lead to significant political developments in the coming decades. As the 19th century continued, the relationship between Britain and its colonies in Canada and Australia began to evolve. What had once been a bond based on the unquestioned dominance of the British Empire was slowly giving way to growing nationalist sentiments. In both Canada and Australia, the question of identity was becoming increasingly important. Each colony was developing its own sense of self, often at odds with the colonial power that had shaped its existence. In Canada, the process of forming a unified country took shape in the latter half of the century. By the time of the Confederation in 1867, the British had begun to grant more autonomy to their colonies. The British North America Act, which created the Dominion of Canada, was a significant step in this direction. This new political entity was granted the power to govern itself, although the British retained control over foreign policy and certain other key aspects of governance. The creation of Canada as a self-governing dominion was a carefully managed process by the British. The British government wanted to avoid the costly and bloody conflicts that had plagued other colonies, and therefore worked to create a system that allowed for peaceful coexistence between French and English Canadians. This was achieved through careful negotiation, especially around the issue of language and cultural rights. Canada's new constitution guaranteed French Canadians the right to maintain their language, culture, and religion, a decision that would shape the future of the country. However, while Canada was granted greater self-governance, its status as a British colony was not entirely erased. The British monarchy remained. The official head of state and Canada's political system was still modeled after British institutions. The Parliament of Canada was based on the British system, and the Governor-General of Canada represented the British monarch. The ties to Britain were strong, and for many Canadians there was still a deep loyalty to the Crown. Meanwhile, in Australia, the process of nation-building was somewhat different. Australia had long been a collection of separate colonies, each with its own government and political structure. The desire for unity and greater self-governance had been growing for decades, but it wasn't until the late 19th century that the colonies began to seriously discuss the idea of federation. The British had no intention of holding on to Australia indefinitely, but they were also wary of the consequences of a fragmented continent. The drive for federation was fueled by a combination of factors. Many Australians felt that they were being held back by the lack of a unified national government. There were economic and logistical benefits to having a single system of governance, particularly as the colonies were becoming increasingly integrated through trade and communication. Moreover, the growth of Australian nationalism and the desire for more local control made the idea of a national government more appealing. In 1899, the British government officially agreed to the idea of Australian Federation, paving the way for the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia. In 1901, Australia's new constitution was modelled after both British and American systems of government, blending the parliamentary system of Britain with the federal structure of the United States. The British monarchy remained the official head of state, and the Governor-General continued to represent the Crown. However, the passage of the Statute of Westminster in 1931 marked a significant step toward full legislative independence for Australia. Despite the political progress, Australia's identity was still closely linked to Britain, and many Australians continued to see themselves as British subjects. The British influence was evident in the widespread use of British cultural practices, institutions, and legal systems. Even the Australian military was closely integrated with the British armed forces, and many Australians fought alongside the British in both world wars throughout. This period, the growing sense of nationalism in both Canada and Australia was shaped by the complex legacy of British colonialism. Both nations had benefited from British rule in many ways, but they also found themselves at a crossroads torn between the loyalty to the British Empire and the desire for greater autonomy. The development of national identities in Canada and Australia would continue throughout the 20th century as they gradually moved away from the shadow of British colonialism. As the new century dawned, both Canada and Australia found themselves at a pivotal moment in their histories. With each passing year, both nations began to assert their independence from British control, but the process was gradual and complex. The influence of Britain was still deeply embedded in the political and cultural life of both colonies, even as they moved toward self-governance. In Canada, the shift toward autonomy was already underway following Confederation in 1867, but it would take several more decades for Canada to fully establish its identity. As a nation, the creation of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 was one of the most significant projects that symbolized both the physical and economic unification of Canada. It was the work of the British and Canadian governments in collaboration with Canadian investors that enabled the completion of the railway, which linked Canada from coast to coast. It was an achievement that was seen as a testament to Canadian determination and British engineering expertise. Yet despite its success, the railway also served to highlight the growing divide between Canada and Britain. While the British government supported the project, the railway was also a symbol of Canada's increasing reliance on its own resources and its desire to move beyond its colonial status. Over time, Canada's political landscape began to shift as well. The issue of Canadian independence was a topic of growing debate, especially during the First and Second World Wars. Canada's participation in these global conflicts showcased the nation's increasing sense of autonomy and its willingness to make decisions independent of Britain. Although Canada had been self-governing for decades, its involvement in the wars demonstrated that it was no longer a mere extension of British policy. Instead, Canada played a crucial role in the war efforts, particularly in World War I, where over 60,000 Canadians lost their lives in the trenches of Europe. The sacrifices made by Canadians during these wars fostered a sense of national pride that would continue to shape the country's identity throughout the 20th century. In Australia, the movement toward self-rule was taking a different path, but the motivations were equally strong. The Commonwealth of Australia was officially created in 1901, and its creation marked the culmination of years of negotiation and compromise between the 6 Australian colonies. The British had allowed the colonies to federate into a unified nation, but they remained the dominant power in foreign policy and defense matters. The early years of Australian federation were dominated by British influence, as the Australian colonies sought to establish a cohesive identity and economic system. As a newly federated nation, Australia continued to look to Britain for leadership and stability, but this dependence began to shift in the early 20th century. A key moment in this shift came during World War I, when Australia sent over 400,000 soldiers to fight alongside British forces in Europe. The war was a defining moment for Australia, not only because of the heavy casualties it sustained, but also because it signified Australia's emerging role as an independent actor on the global stage. Australia's contributions to the war effort were seen by many as a testament to the country's maturity and autonomy. While the nation remained loyal to Britain, the experiences of war also led to growing calls for greater control over its foreign policy and military matters. After the war, Australia became increasingly disillusioned with Britain's leadership in global affairs. The signing of the Statute of Westminster in 1931 marked a critical moment in Australia's journey toward full legislative independence. The Statute of Westminster granted the Commonwealth of Australia and other dominions the right to make their own laws without the approval of the British Parliament. It was a landmark step that signaled the decline of British control over Australia's internal affairs. However, it wasn't until the passage of the Australia Act in 1986 that Australia fully severed its remaining constitutional ties with Britain. The Australia Act eliminated the ability of British courts to hear appeals from Australian courts and removed the British monarch's role in the Australian legal system. The change was symbolic of Australia's full transition from a British colony to an independent nation, but the cultural ties to Britain remained strong for decades to come. In Canada, the journey toward full independence was similarly gradual. Although Canada had already gained a significant degree of self-rule by the time of World War I, the British North America Act of 1867 had established Canada as a dominion within the British Empire. But it was not until the Statute of Westminster in 1931 that Canada was granted full legislative independence from Britain. The statute gave Canada the power to pass its own laws without the need for British approval, but it did not immediately result in the severance of all ties with Britain. The British monarch remained Canada's head of state, and the country's foreign policy was still tied to British interests. This situation persisted until the patriation of the Canadian Constitution in 1982. With the passage of the Canada Act in 1982, Canada finally gained complete control over its constitution and formally severed its remaining legal ties to Britain. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was introduced alongside the new Constitution, was a cornerstone of this transition and served as a foundational document for Canada's identity as an independent nation. While Canada had always considered itself a separate entity from Britain, the final step in the country's legal independence was a long time coming and was marked by the desire to define its own national identity. The cultural influence of Britain remained strong in both Canada and Australia well into the 20th century, and even today remnants of British colonial rule can still be seen in the systems of government language and legal frameworks of both nations. But by the end of the 20th century, the identities of Canada and Australia were firmly rooted in their own histories and experiences rather than in the shadow of British colonialism. Both nations had emerged from the colonial era to become independent countries with their own political systems and cultural identities. The influence of Britain had been undeniable, but the process of nation-building in both Canada and Australia was driven by the desire to create something distinct from the empire that had once ruled. Both nations had transformed from colonies into modern states, with their own sense of pride and autonomy. And while the legacies of British rule would remain part of their shared histories, the future was theirs to shape. As the 20th century unfolded, both Canada and Australia continued their journeys toward full independence from British influence, but this evolution was not without its challenges. The relationship with Britain had been transformed by the two world wars, which had changed the global order and irrevocably altered the bonds between the empire and its former colonies. Canada's involvement in both world wars had a profound impact on its national identity, with the sacrifice of over 60,000 Canadians in World War I and the more than 40,000 who served in World War II. Canada began to forge a distinct identity separate from Britain. No longer could Canada be seen merely as an extension of the British Empire, but as a sovereign nation that was willing to make decisions for itself. The wars brought Canadians together under a shared sense of duty and patriotism, but also fostered a growing desire for greater autonomy in foreign policy and military matters. The post-war years were marked by a heightened sense of Canadian nationalism and the beginning of a push toward full independence. The British Crown remained the official head of state, but by the early 20th century, many Canadians began to question the necessity of this symbolic connection. With the passing of the Statute of Westminster in 1931, Canada was granted full control over its domestic affairs and could no longer be overruled by the British Parliament. However, the monarchy remained a fixture in Canada's constitutional framework, and the real shift toward complete independence would not occur until the patriation of Canada's constitution in 1982. This was the final step in Canada's emergence as a fully sovereign state. The patriation process was marked by the creation of the Canada Act, which effectively severed the last legal ties with Britain. While Canada had already been exercising increasing autonomy by the mid-20th century, the passage of the Canada Act marked the official end of colonial control. The British monarch remained the ceremonial head of state, But the role was now symbolic, and the real power lay with the elected Canadian government. The introduction of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was another milestone in the country's evolution away from British. The charter outlined fundamental rights and freedoms for all Canadians and became a cornerstone of Canadian identity. By enshrining these rights in the Constitution, Canada ensured that its identity would be shaped by the will of its people rather than the influence of a distant monarch. While the monarchy retained a presence in the national life of Canada, the country had become fully self-governing, a modern nation with its own democratic institutions and cultural identity. The cultural ties to Britain remained strong, but Canada's legal and political independence was undeniable. By contrast, Australia's journey toward full independence took a different route, but was equally influenced by global events. World War had a profound impact on Australia's relationship with Britain and the wider world. The sacrifice of over 60,000 Australian soldiers in the conflict forged a deeper sense of national pride and identity. Australia's involvement in the war had cemented its place as a valued partner within the British Empire, but it also fueled growing calls for greater self-determination. As Australia entered the post-war era, the desire for an Australian identity distinct from British influence became more pronounced. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster gave Australia legislative independence from Britain, but it wasn't until 1986 that Australia completely severed its remaining legal ties with the British Crown. The passage of the Australia Act in that year granted Australia full control over its legal and constitutional matters. This was a symbolic moment in Australia's development as a sovereign nation. While the British monarch remained the formal head of state in Australia, the monarchy's influence was now limited to ceremonial duties. The political and legal systems in Australia were now independent, and the country was able to make its own decisions without interference from Britain. The transition to full independence was a process that spanned over a century, but by the late 20th century, Australia had emerged as a fully self-governing nation with a strong sense of its own national identity. The legacy of British influence remained deeply embedded in Australia's legal and political systems, but the cultural ties to Britain began to weaken. As Australia's population grew more diverse and its international connections expanded, the country began to develop its own unique cultural identity. In the years that followed, the move toward a republic became a topic of national debate. In 1999, a referendum was held to determine whether Australia should become a republic with an Australian head of state rather than a British monarch. Although the referendum was unsuccessful, the conversation about Australia's future continued. In the years since, Australia has made significant strides toward embracing its unique identity and moving away from its colonial past. The legacy of British rule still remains in the shared legal traditions, language, and symbols, but Australia's place on the world stage is now defined by its own values and aspirations. The story of both Canada and Australia is one of evolution from colonies to independent nations. Their paths to independence were shaped by the influence of Britain, but also by the determination of their people to forge their own futures. Both nations have retained elements of their British heritage, but have developed their own distinct identities that are rooted in their histories, geography, and people. The enduring legacy of British influence can still be seen in the institutions and practices of both countries, but it is now only one part of their rich and complex national identities. Canada and Australia are now fully independent countries that stand as examples of how former colonies can emerge as strong and autonomous nations. The history of British imperialism is an integral part of their past, but it is no longer the defining feature of their futures. As they continue to grow and evolve in the 21st century, Canada and Australia will undoubtedly face new challenges and opportunities, but their shared history as part of the British Empire has provided a foundation upon which they have built their modern identities. Today, both nations stand as proud examples of how former colonies can thrive independently while still honoring their shared heritage. With each passing year, the ties to Britain continue to fade as both nations assert their place in the world as sovereign states.